Welcome, Jennifer. It's so lovely to have you again on our Shifting the Needle podcast. Just so I can introduce Jennifer for you, Jennifer Petriglieri is the author of a book called Couples That Work. But today we're going to be talking about the other aspect, the broader aspect of her work, which is she's an associate professor on the organisational behaviour, and she's a specialist in women's leadership development. Jennifer, that is something that I'm really, really interested in. And so I'm so delighted that you can join me today to have a
Great to be with you
about it. Great. So tell me a bit about the journey into women's leadership development. What, first of all, got you into that particular lane?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I started off, and I still do a lot of work on sort of general leadership development. And really about 10 years ago was when the kind of gender narrative was exploding in organizations, this push for gender balance. And what we were experiencing at INSEAD, the business school where I teach, is a lot of companies were coming to us and saying, essentially, not in these words, please take the women and fix them. You know, we're going to send you the women for a week and send them back to us, and then they'll go do well in their careers. And I was like, it's very tricky dynamic. So I started to really look and research at this and think, why is it that women are not reaching the top? Because the assumption in businesses at that time was it was a lack of ambition, or it was about childcare. You know, women take time out, and then when they come back, they're too busy, and you know, they just don't make it. And of course, what the research shows is a very different picture, right? This is really about what I call a web of systemic challenges. Okay, and some of these are well known, like systemic bias. Others of them are less well known. So if we think about networking, right, we know that it's much more difficult for women to build informal networks in organizations than men. And of course, the more senior we go in organizations, the more that holds us back. You know, just one example, we know very often that norms in organizations don't favor women. We know about the double bind of speaking up, that when women speak up in meetings, they're likely to be ignored or people steal their ideas. So there's this whole host of things going on. And what the narrative was at that time was just teach them about leadership. When I looked at this, I really thought, that's not what we need to teach them about. What we need to do when we look at leadership development for women is open their eyes to this systemic web of challenges and look at how can you navigate through it. So this is not just a leadership program for women. It's really, what are the extra challenges we as women face, and how can we kind of jump over them or run around them so that we can kind of keep in that race with the men. And that's when I really started to get excited about it, because I was not at all interested in fixing the women, you know, but I am very interested in helping women understand what are these systemic issues and how can we as senior women try to navigate around them.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We do a lot of parental transition coaching, and after 15 years of doing it, it took us a while to recognise is probably 5 years ago, we recognised, do you know what, we need to get to the women earlier. Because the one thing that women who are going through the maternity transition is busy.
Yeah.
And I call it the broken bridge, Jennifer, which is we've got, you know, young women coming through, and, you know, everybody wants to know what Generation Y women think. Everybody, all the reports are around that. And then we've got older women that maybe have made it already and come up through that system. But then what happens is there's a kink in the road or a broken bridge in the middle, because although I know what you're saying, it's not all about becoming a mother, because, you know, problems occur for all women in their careers, but a huge kink in the road and leak in the pipeline is around the transition to being a mother. But it wasn't enough just to go in and do parental transition coaching. We need to get to women at a younger stage. And what we found, we did some research into younger women, and what we found was that everybody assumed, a lot of the people that we spoke to at a leadership level assumed that women lacked confidence.
Yeah.
And I think this is such a myth, because when we ran the research, I mean, we ran focus group after focus group, and because obviously it was qualitative research, we didn't introduce any of we didn't them. The word confidence never came up. Not once out of all of those focus groups before we were structuring our questionnaire.
It's not about confidence. And what happens is it's really interesting. It's about demographics. So if we think we're having children a little bit later than we did before, it's becoming quite unusual to have children in your 20s. Most of us wait until our early or mid 30s or even late 30s. And what happens then, you're right with this broken bridge, is that there's two worlds colliding. There's the world of becoming a mother and the pressures and the childcare and all this sort of stuff. But it's also a time in our careers where we're getting to that position where we're a bit more senior. And that's when a lot of the gender bias kicks in. So we're getting a double whammy. Whereas paradoxically, if we have children a little bit earlier, we're just dealing mainly with the childcare aspects. And the kind of kickback against women really starts at that middle to senior manager level. And that just happens because of when we're having children now to happen at exactly the same time. So these things can really confound each other. And it's very easy for a woman to sit and think, it's because I've just had children. And of course, it's yes, but that's not the only reason.
That's right.
And I think it's about recognizing the whole picture of this.
And it's very easy for leaders to think, I have gone in and pitched to, about, not even pitched, I've been invited in by leaders of organizations which are quite male dominant and been asked what I think the issues are. And when I've asked the question, one of the things that comes up is only natural that women are going to want to be with their children. And I find that, even with all of the movement in neuroscience that shows that the brain is plastic, that sort of essentialist argument that women are fundamentally more into caring for children still prevails.
It is, and it's really interesting. And so my background way back when at undergraduate was I was a geneticist and I specialized in evolution and human evolution. And when we look back at the past, and particularly when we look back at, for example, some tribes in Africa are still hunter-gatherer tribes, what we find is it's a really demographic game. And the women who have children are also of the age which is prime, go out there and help the tribe. And they're not the ones who are actually doing most of the childcare. And actually, the childcare is much more balanced between men and women than certainly we are in the modern world today. And so that's really a post-industrial myth, really from the time of the Industrial Revolution. And even if we look back to before the Industrial Revolution, when we have very good records of what families did, the childcare was much more evenly split. And again, much more in the hands of the grandparents, the spinster aunts, whatever that cultural reference is for you. So it's just not true, that narrative that it has to be the mother, the biological mother. And, for those of us who were adopted as children will know, it's not about biology at all, actually. We can be very well looked after by someone who we're not at all related to.
Yeah. And I think recently, didn't they find some archaeologists found some females, warriors from way back, and they were buried with their spears.
Yeah.
I always think, the natural argument, my husband's a really keen safariist, and we go on holiday on safari and you watch the lions, and you think, I think the women are doing quite a lot of the work there.
Yeah.
Aren't they? So, and I think a fascinating perspective on this is who's writing the story that, who's writing the history. As you say, you're a geneticist, and we need to have more of that fact.
And I also think we need to be clear about the statistics. It is true that there's very few women really at the top of our organizations even today. But it's also true that the vast majority of mothers are working mothers.
Yes.
Now, for structural reasons, they may have not got to the top, but they're still working full time. And I think the problem when we just focus on the few women at the top is not only is the narrative it's hard for women to get to the top, which is correct, but the narrative becomes it's hard for women to work full time. That's not what the statistics show. Most women work full time, actually. Right. And we need to be really careful about this narrative. It doesn't mean it's hard to work full time as a mother. What it means is it's hard to access the leadership positions. And that's a very different question.
Yes. I must say that quite a lot of my push has been about being more flexible, and you will retain and you will attract more women. Because I think it's the law profession recently in law, they've done some analysis and found that, and we found this in the research we did with law firms, that, you know, so few want to become partners. Now, what's interesting is that's now not just females.
Yes.
It's
And
young men as well. Say,
and this is really coming back to my other research on working couples. And what the question is, what do we mean by flexibility? And I think the narrative of flexibility has been 3 days a week. But when I look at working couples, men and women, what the vast majority want is not part-time working. What they want is what I call marginal flexibility, which means, can we have flexibility around the margins? I want to work as hard as other people. I want that same career, but actually it doesn't work for me to be on between, you know, 8 and 6 every day. Like I have to be, you know, I need that marginal flexibility that some days I finish early and then log back on in the evening, or I take a time out in the day. And just what we see in the research is those small pockets of marginal flexibility make a huge difference. Yeah. And I think the thing which frightens organizational leaders, especially law firms, I work with law firms a lot, is when you talk flexibility, they kind of think, I can't have a partner who only works 2 days a week. It's like, that's not what it's about. It's really about, how do we get out of this FaceTime culture? And of course, the issue for law firms is the way they log their hours, right? Which makes it really pernicious dynamic. But you know, how do we get out of this idea that a good worker is on between X and Y in a day? And if you're not fulfilling that ideal, it somehow makes you a bad worker.
Yeah, I think you're right. The billable hours culture is definitely pernicious when it comes to trying to make change here. And especially is what I really think companies need to think about is it's not having flexible work policy. I mean, even the word is wrong, isn't it? Policing it, that's just sending all the wrong signals. But it's having a flexible work strategy. It's actually, and actually I do ultimately think it should be default that the jobs are flexible. Yeah, that should be the default position, not.
In fact, we've done some research, which you will love, Geraldine, with a company called Mirvac, who are an Australian company, and they're a construction company, so really like man's world. And a new CEO came in, and she was actually one of our alumni, and she really took the research on productivity seriously. And she was like, I've got to get everyone flexible working. Now, she knew the women would do it immediately, but that wasn't going to help her. So what she did was she got her senior team, who were all guys, and she said, I have one objective for you this year, and it's that you build some marginal flexibility into your work and you tell everybody about it. And she's like, I don't care what you do, but I care that you tell people. Yeah. Within a year, the whole culture of the organization had changed, because people looked up to these senior guys and thought, well, if he is finishing early 1 day a week to pick his kids up from school, I can as well. Or if he's going for a run in the middle of the day, so can I. And what she found was it was very small things they were doing, but the fact that it was the senior men that were doing them and telling people about them made a huge difference. So it's actually rather easy to change. The problem is we start with the wrong people. We shouldn't be starting with the women. We should be starting with the men.
And that does bring me back to a question about inviting young women to female-only programs, and to the issue of whether to have female employee resource groups, female networks. What's your thoughts on that?
So I think we need to be quite nuanced about this. So I think in terms of leadership development kind of programs themselves, I think it can be helpful if what we're doing with them is training them around the real challenges they're going to face because they're women. I think ring fencing women for extra leadership development is really unhelpful dynamic within the organization. There's actually research on the networks. What we find in the research is they're really helpful if they're cross-organization, so they're industry-wide networks. Yeah. They're actually a little bit counterproductive when they're within one organization. Because again, what's happening is you're ring fencing the women. And we know in particular, it's really hard for women to build networks within an organization. And by ring fencing them, it's like, tick, I've done my networking, now I can move on. But what you're creating essentially is an echo chamber, right? Where I'm connected to all the other women, but not connected to any of the men. So I think, some people can be a bit black and white about this, like it's terrible, you should always include everybody, and other people are like, no, we need to do everything for the women. I'm somewhere in the middle. There's research on this. Let's make sure when we get the women together, it's for a purpose that definitely serves them and is relevant to them, and that it's not inadvertently creating an echo chamber, which is actually further isolating them from the group.
And I think with the leadership development, I mean, I'm a great believer that you do actually get younger women together. And the reason for that is you absolutely have to say this is not about fixing them. This is, and it's not actually about them navigating a system. I actually believe it's about getting them to change the system.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to pull them together, to get them to have strength in numbers, to recognize, because I absolutely don't think that younger women see systemic bias. A lot of the time, they just really don't feel that it's there, and they feel that it's a bit, second wave feminism to do this kind of stuff. When in actual fact, this systemic bias does exist. They don't know the numbers in terms of, they haven't looked at the numbers. And what I like to do is to get them together to open their eyes to that, and to use the development work to be about personal development, not about, fixing you to make you more confident, to make you confident.
I'm with you. And I think, to be fair to the more junior women, the reason they often don't see it is it's very often not in play so heavily at their level.
No.
So those entry level jobs are 50. So if I'm a junior woman and I look around and say, well we're 50-50, what's the issue? To be fair, it doesn't reflect their experience. Exactly. But it's like, you wait 10 years. And I often find this, it's really interesting at INSEAD. So if I take the MBA population, who are sort of late 20s, there's a good portion of them who are like, yeah, this doesn't exist. If I fast forward to the executive MBAs, who are not that much older, they're mid-30s, so we're talking 7-8 years older on average, 100% of them realize it exists. So we can see there's this age, which of course equates to our career stage, where it really starts to kick in. Yeah. And that tends to be when we start getting on that leadership ladder, which for most of us tends to be early 30s, isn't it? When we get our first chunky job and suddenly realize, oops, it's not so straightforward.
No, as I thought. And so, I talk about the different stages of a women's career and the importance of intervening from a leadership development point with a different message at the different stages. Because they are in a different phase. But what's quite difficult is when you get them together in a room. Quite often I've been in rooms where you might find that the male leaders take advantage of the lack of unanimity from the different females. Yeah. And because they don't seem aligned about the issues. So you've got younger women who maybe don't see the problem. And then you've got older women who may have come up through the ranks and feel, well, I did it, so you can do it, the superwoman type. Yeah. And then you've got, as I say, the less vocal middle. Yeah. That are just like so busy, they don't even attend the meeting. Yeah.
But I think you're right. It's a very different. So at INSEAD, I run a program for very senior female leaders, so CEOs, board level. And what's really important at that level is building a peer support network, because they're almost always the only one, right? And if we think at a more junior level or even a mid-level, women still probably have a few peers. But at that level, that idea of peer support network is absolutely vital. But if you said that to a 25-year-old, it would make no sense at all. So I think you're right. We've got to tailor it to the stage they're at.
And we find actually that group coaching among senior women is actually really powerful.
Very powerful.
Rather than just, individual coaching is always helpful, but group coaching among senior women, because they can share their experience and realize that, they're also seeing the same thing. And I think that's very edifying, to not think that you're doing something wrong, because I do think we have been primed to imagine, to first look to ourselves, that we might not be quite getting it right, when in actual fact, when you hear a number of people reinforcing that they're also experiencing, for example, the double bind dilemma, where, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Yeah. It's so confusing that, I've had feedback in my corporate career where I was very challenging. That's really good, Geraldine, and a bit challenging. And it's like, So which is it here? Now, I do get that, it can be an overdone strength, but nonetheless, I do think there was a gendered dimension often.
Of course, and that's classic feedback we see when we analyze the feedback that women get versus men, is they tend to get a lot of the to feedback. You're too this, you're too that. You're just a little bit too overbearing, or you're just not quite confident enough, or, and this is really unhelpful feedback because, well, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean, and what effect does that have on each other? And as you say, this is where the peer coaching can be really helpful to just unpack what does it mean.
Yeah, on the confidence thing, I think also there's evidence, isn't there, that in appraisals they've done some meta-analysis and looked at appraisal ratings and looked at the comments for women, and it tends to be given in a sense of you are not a very confident person.
Yeah.
Instead of more of a growth mindset, which is
like you come across as, or
you could in that situation. Whereas with men, it is in that when we're with clients and you do this, you could, and it's much more practical, constructive. Whereas there's a sense in the feedback to women that it's endemic to their gender and not something that they can do anything about.
Yeah. A lot to work on.
A lot to work on. Where do you think companies should start?
I actually think they should start with the senior men.
Yeah.
And I think the danger of focusing too much on the women is it doesn't just become about helping them. It's about, please, you fix the problem that is being forced on you by someone else, which is really unfair when you think about it. Mm-hmm. And I think what I find, I always think of, I can always divide the men in an organization into three kind of chunks. There's the hardcore resistors, but increasingly there are very few of those, actually, really very few of them. And then there's a small group of guys who completely get it and 100% on board. That group is growing, but it's still relatively small. And then there's a huge group in the middle who simply don't get it, but they're very well intentioned. And it actually does not take a lot to convert that big middle group into that second group, who are the guys who are really supportive. And I think if, I always say, if everyone stopped women's development for 1 year and just focused on that group of men in the middle, we would move the needle hugely, right? We would hugely move the needle. Because these are not men who are resistant. They're not men who are sexist. They're not trying to keep women back. They just don't really understand the situation. And again, fair enough, they're not a woman, right? They're not in that situation. And it doesn't take much. They're men who the door is able to be pushed, and you don't need to take much to push it open. So I think that is the place, and the organizations who are really starting there, just like when I talked about, the marginal flexibility, we start with the men. The organizations who are starting there and the organizations who are shifting the needle most closely. Now, of course, in an ideal world, you'd focus on many layers at the same time. You'd obviously focus on the women as well. But I think when we focus on the women without focusing on those middle men, we're really doing women a disservice, because they're essentially going back into the same battle. It's like, I'm going to try and plump you up and make you feel good about yourself and give you a few tools. Please go back and get in the firing line and again.
Change the world as well.
Yeah, which is really not going to help anyone, and it's quite demoralizing. So I think we've got to have a dual focus on how do we work on both sides of the equation.
And the expression, you will never get the turkeys to vote for Christmas.
Yeah.
Doesn't come to play in that, or you've only got a few turkeys, they're the resistors.
I think there are less turkeys in organizations than people imagine. I think it's quite easy to point the finger at the man and say they're at fault. But of course, a system is reinforced by all of us. And I often, say to the senior women, okay, how often would you ask your female colleagues, like, who's going to look after the kids when you travel? And how often do you ask that question to your male colleagues? Mm. Right? And it shows our bias as well, right? And so we are also a part of the problem, right? The problem hurts us, but we are also a part of it.
We're all in the system.
Yeah, and I think it's really important we recognize that, because the sooner we recognize we're also doing things to reinforce the system, of course unconsciously, but we still do them. And then you can see how actually most of the men are just doing what we're doing it's just a bit easier for them to do it.
Yeah.
But I think you'll be surprised. There are very few turkeys out there. Of course, there are some. But Christmas is coming. They're going to get eaten.
That's true. Exactly. Jennifer, yet again, an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And again, I could chat to you for quite some time on this, but that's been really, really helpful. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Geraldine.